Okay, everyone. So this is general meeting number 6. That means that this is the last meeting that counts for credit. So please make sure you sign in and sign out. If you don't, there's not much I can do after that. Okay. So let me move through. So just a reminders, the officer applications are due today. So if you are interested and haven't received it, you need to send me your email address and I will email it to you. And then officer and membership requirements are also due today. So please have your things in right away so that we can have enough time to update everything on our behalf. Okay, and then once again, these are the requirements. You can also find this on RowdyLink, YouTube, on our social media platforms, and on GroupMe. These are the available positions for the spring semester. So we have Public Relations 2, Volunteer Coordinator 1 and 2, and then Fundraising Chair. Our merchandise, and then I believe there's going to be new merchandise next semester. So Alexis will let y'all know for sure later on. And then these are our payment methods. So you can send in your donations or dues through here. So with dues, they were due October 26th, but I know people forgot or are still trying to submit them. So just go ahead and do it by midnight. And then courts. I sent the court sign up a few times in the GroupMe already. I'll send it again tonight. So please make sure that you sign up and you're only eligible if you complete membership requirements. If you're unsure about your eligibility, send me a message and I can handle that with you. You can also talk to Alexis. And then our last meeting of the semester will be our end of semester celebration. So we're going to present our graduating officers and members. We're going to introduce the new officers and we will also discuss the spring general plan. And then make sure to join us on social media if you have not already, because we are still going to stay active during the winter break. The last thing we're going to do is a campus scavenger hunt. Again, socials do not count for credit at all. This is just for fun. And if you complete the list for the day, you will be entered into a raffle. Okay, so Dr. Lawson will now present and there you go. You should be able to share your screen, Dr. Lawson.
Perfect. Thank you, Debbie. Hi, everyone. I just want to quickly say hi to everyone. We have a little bit of a talk going on in the chat. I want to say thank you guys for joining tonight. 35 people, I think, is pretty good attendance for this point in the semester. It's hard to believe that this semester is almost done and starting to wind down. So thank you guys again for coming to join. As I'm getting this PowerPoint up and running, I kind of thought that we could all probably use a pick-me-up and some good news. People are saying like, oh, I'm so stressed in the chat and everything. So go ahead, why don't you guys drop like something good that is going on and some good news that you could just share with us in the chat to help lift us up as I'm getting my PowerPoint up and running. Yay, I love seeing some things come in about gain raises, qualified for the GI Bill. That's amazing. Oh, little girl babysitting, turning 2. Yes, love that celebratory energy. Oh, that's great, Debbie. Congrats. Yay, I love this. You know, I think sharing good news is lots of celebration coming in for Debbie and everyone else. That's great. Thank you guys. And I'm so happy to hear the good things going on in life, you know. Alexis is like, I'm gonna cry. Happy birthday, Megan. All right. Okay. Thanks everyone for engaging in that positive good news sharing. I feel like even just that little, taking a couple of minutes to just acknowledge that yes, life is kind of stressful, but we still have good things going on and good things to celebrate, and to share that with each other, I think is really great. So please feel free to keep dropping your good news announcements into the chat. But I'm going to go ahead and continue on with my presentation just so we don't completely run out of time. So I am Dr. Monica Lawson. I come to Psych Club quite a few times to give talks. I was here just last week talking about graduate school applications and personal statements in particular. So I believe many of you guys are familiar with me, but if this is your first time coming to a presentation that I'm doing, I'm really happy that you're here, happy that we're getting the chance to connect. And at the end of this presentation, I will give you my contact information if you have any questions or want to reach out to me. So today I'm going to be talking about my research lab, and I've done this quite a few times in Psych Club. So I kind of formatted my talk a little bit differently, to where I'm going to tell you guys broadly about what my lab does, but then I thought I would get into the weeds just a little bit and outline a study that I published somewhat recently, to give you guys more of a concrete idea of the type of work that my lab does and the things that we care about. So that's kind of the focus I'm coming in with this meeting. But first, for those of you who don't know me, I do like to always just provide a bit of background information on myself when I'm talking with students. I really believe that students have to hear stories of people to see their own path forward. So just want to tell you a little bit more about me. You can probably tell that I am not from the South. I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and I grew up in this small town that I had pictured here called Johnstown, which is close to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, if you're familiar. And Johnstown is a really small city. You can see it. It's tiny. But every time that I have said at UTSA that I'm from Johnstown, there is always someone who knows of Johnstown. And people often know about it because it is historic for flooding and major deaths resulting from the floods. So very depressed history in this town, but this is where I'm from. And you can easily see, like with the mountains and the hills, if we get a lot of rain or a dam breaks, we are at the valley, so things can go wrong quite fast. I think something that is maybe more relevant to you guys is I am a first gen student. My older sister, who's 2 years older than me, went to college, but before that, virtually no one in my entire family has. Cousins have not gone to college, parents, aunts, uncles. I have like 2 aunts that have college degrees out of many. So first gen is very much a part of my identity. And I think another thing that I have in common with some of the students here at UTSA is I went to a small branch campus for undergrad. So I went to a branch campus of University of Pittsburgh that was in my hometown. So I was a commuter student, and I know we have a lot of students like that here too. So I was bouncing back and forth between my home and campus quite often. So that's a perspective that I take when working with students. Now, talking more about transitioning into my research lab and the type of work that I do, at the time that I was in college, my family had what I would call our own personal baby boom. So this is a picture of my grandparents with several, although not all, of their great grandchildren. When I was in college, my freshman year, my niece Danica, who is the one in the back in the purple and blue dress, she was born. And within the next 5 years, my family had, I think, 14 kids. And we were all growing up in the same area. Many of my cousins, siblings still live in the same area. So I was with my family constantly. And at the same time, I was a psych major, and I started to get involved in research. And the research I was doing at the time was kind of this social cognitive research looking at eyewitness testimony. So it was this cognitive social research that had very clear forensic implications. And as I was doing this work, it really spoke to me on the importance of psychology in addressing real world problems. And as I was doing this work, and as I was interacting with my family as it was growing with all these children, I started to wonder about how the legal system works out when children are involved. And then also, how can scientists, psychological scientists, inform the legal system for when children are involved as victims or witnesses of crime? So after I graduated from my undergrad degree, I went to the University of Toledo in Ohio for my PhD, where I specialized in child witness memory. So my research there really focused on autobiographical memory development, and you will see it still does, but also having this very clear forensic implication of how does this information on children's memory development help inform the legal system when children are involved as witnesses? I graduated in 2016, which feels like yesterday, but I realize it is not. And then after that, I went on to do a postdoc, which I think we've talked before with this group. A postdoc is training after your PhD, and it can last for like a variety of years, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, maybe even. It's more specialized training after your PhD. So you would think a PhD is it, but that's not necessarily true. So after I got my PhD, I did a postdoc at the University of Notre Dame with Kristen Valentino, and I'm going to highlight a study I've done with her. But this postdoc was really pivotal to my development, because all the work that I was doing at the University of Toledo on children's memory development and eyewitness testimony capabilities was all conducted with children who have not been involved in the legal system, and children who, to us, we had no knowledge on if those children had prior experiences of trauma that would put them in the legal system. Still important, it still has important implications, but I really wanted to start working with children who have actually witnessed events that put them in the legal system or that had been victimized themselves. So when I was a postdoc, I started working on memory development among children who have been abused and neglected. So that's more of what I'm going to talk about today. Okay. I'm going to catch my breath and also allow a second. Does anyone have any questions or comments?
With your studies, are they longitudinal? Like
I will
Okay.
get into that. Yeah, I have done longitudinal studies and cross-sectional as well. So cross-sectional would be at one time point. Yeah, great question. So the research that I focus on now is really around memory development, as well as social and emotional development among children who have experienced abuse and neglect. Something I like to do is, make sure that we have an appreciation for how big of a problem this is. So I know it's kind of late. It's almost 5:20 already on a Tuesday evening, but I'm hoping you guys can engage in a brief activity that I have for us real quick. So this is a picture, probably looks familiar to you guys. This is a cross section of the Alamo Dome. How many of you guys have been going to football games? Yeah, Alexis? Yeah, I'm seeing some hands go up. Yeah, going to the football game, supporting our awesome team, our undefeated team right now. So for those of you who have gone to the football games and you've been in the Alamo Dome, or those of you who are just familiar, I want you to think about how big that arena is. You know, it's quite big. And think about how busy it gets, the hustle and bustle with all the people being there going to the games and tailgating and whatnot. And imagine that crowd. Now, with this piece of information, I know we don't quite hit capacity yet with our football team, but the Alamo Dome has a capacity to seat 64,000 people. Okay, so those of you who have gone to the games, I think recently we've been gained, a couple, like maybe 10 or 15,000 or so in attendance. But imagine if this place was filled, 64,000 people, okay? Now I have a question for you guys. How many Alamo Dome stadiums do you think we would need to contain all of the children that are involved in child abuse and neglect investigations each year in the United States? And you can just shout out guesses, or you can throw them in the chat. 5, 7, 6, 20. Okay, we have 20 at 35, 14. Another 25, 10, another 10. Any other guesses? Bella coming in with 50, going high. Okay, so we have a huge range from 5 to 50, with 50 maybe being seen at the far end here of our guesses, but Bella actually gets to take home the prize today that does not exist. 50. We would need 50 filled to capacity Alamo Dome stadiums to contain the 3.5 million children that are investigated for abuse and neglect each year in our country. If we put that another way, that means that approximately every 7 days, this stadium is filling up with children who are involved in these investigations every week, guys. So I hope this illustrates to you that child abuse and neglect is a major problem here in our country. It's a huge problem internationally, but for sure here in the USA, it's also a huge problem here in Texas. About 300,000 children are investigated each year in Texas, with about 60,000 being substantiated victims. So this means they went through the investigative process, they did the investigation, perhaps even went to a criminal trial, and the children were determined to be victims of abuse and neglect. 60,000 here in Texas. And if we look even closer here in San Antonio accounts for approximately 10% of the abused and neglected children in Texas. We have here in Bexar County, we have the highest rate of child abuse and neglect of all metropolitan cities in Texas. So certainly a problem worldwide in our country, in Texas, and it's a huge problem right here in our own community. So I said we would need 50 stadiums to hold the children who have been investigated for abuse and neglect, the 3.5 million children. But we would only need approximately 11 stadiums to contain the 700,000 children that are determined substantiated victims. So there's a huge discrepancy between children that get investigated and children who end up getting substantiated through an investigative process. Now, this is actually a problem that developmental psychology can help to address, and that I try to help to address through my research. when a child comes forward, is disclosing abuse or is otherwise reported to maybe be having these experiences, I think a lot of people would be really surprised to know that often these investigations can be really challenging. And there's several reasons why they can be challenging, but two main ones I think are important to highlight. One is often these experiences do not have outside witnesses. These events tend to happen in secrecy or within the family, and other people may not know about them. And that means that we don't have other people to help provide evidence as witnesses. So often what happens is we have the child who is the witness, the alleged victim, and we have the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator that is going to tell us their side of the story. The other thing that makes this very complicated that I think is surprising is most of these cases do not have any physical evidence. Even in cases, if we're getting really real here, even in cases of sexual abuse where there's penetration, only 5% of those cases have any form of medical evidence. So we're often in these situations where very high stakes situations for the child, in terms of getting them supports and making sure they're healthy and safe, and very high stakes for the perpetrator, right? In terms of figuring out, is this person going to jail? What are going to be the ramifications for this person? It's very high stakes. Real quick, I see a question in here in the chat. Wouldn't it be obvious if there was physical abuse due to bruises and other wounds on the children? You may think it would be obvious, but it can be incredibly challenging because often, I mean, there's lots of reasons why we have bruises. There's lots of reasons why we break bones, for example. There's a lot of alternative hypotheses as to why something can be happening, even something as physically obvious as a bruise, right? There could be lots of reasons. Even if the bruise is in the shape of an object, for example, like, was that abusive, or did the child, somehow fall and it ended up in that shape? It can be ambiguous. Not to say that there's definitely things that are clear cut too, but those cases tend to be a very small minority of cases compared to all the ones that are investigated. So we have this issue, right, where it's really high stakes, and we have to decide, does the child belong in these hypothetical 11 stadiums with the children who are determined to be abuse and neglect through the government investigation process or not? And again, really high stakes. High stakes for the child. We know that these experiences are related with negative consequences across a lifespan for most children. There certainly are protective factors where children who have these experiences do not go on to these, later stages of conduct, behavior problems, and psychopathology, school problems, and whatnot. But we do see that this does set up children at risk for these later problems. And this is also a really huge economic problem. I think this is really interesting data. This is showing just for first-time victims in 2014, which is the most recent I could find this data for. Just for first-time victims in that calendar year, the lifetime cost of these experiences is $5.9 trillion. And that's because it's associated with all the supports that these individuals need. And then also, unfortunately, sometimes we see recidivism and we see gain linked in later into the criminal justice system later on. So all of these things are really important, not only from an individual, but from an economic standpoint as well. I can pause and I can take questions at any time. Any other questions, comments? Is this informative, helpful? So linking this back up to what I do in my research lab, I like to think about it in terms of Tivia has some really great questions that I'll get to. In terms of my research program, I like to think about myself as having two broad goals. And the first goal is, how can I, as a developmental scientist, conduct research that is going to, and generate knowledge that is going to help children. And one thing that was already brought up in the chat is we're often going to speak with these children about their experiences through a formal investigative or forensic interview. So from a standpoint as a developmental psychologist, how can I help? Well, I can start to answer questions like, how should adults talk with children to elicit accurate and complete accounts about their experiences? And I can also do research, and I do, looking at, well, how do children even recall the past? How do they talk about negative experience, such as abuse and neglect? And what factors influence what children tell us? So that's one part of my research, is how can I help inform the identification of children who have been abused and neglected? And then the second part of my research is, well, once we find those children, I don't just want to find them and be like, okay, yeah, you had this experience, let's go on with our lives. No, we also want to support them, right? Once we find these kids and we realize what is happening, we want to make sure that we're providing supports that are going to help them grow into healthy young adults and beyond. So here, a lot of my research, and this is actually the part that I'm going to talk about a bit, even though I know there's a question about forensic interviewing, so I'll get back to that. But a lot of my research here actually focuses on the family system. So if you have taken developmental psychology with me or others, you have likely seen this model before. This is Uri Bronfenbrenner's bioecological model. And it's basically this model that says, as individuals, we have various levels of our environment or our ecosystems. And these various levels are represented here as the different concentric circles. And these levels represent different organizations, different levels of institutions, and different levels of, interactions with people. But at these levels, they're all exuding force down on the individual, and they're all contributing to how we develop. And we see here in the green, we see the individual. The microsystem here includes the family, the home, the immediate environment. And this is very intentional that it's right next to the individual, because it's proposed that level of the ecosystem or the environment is going to have the greatest influence on development. So that's kind of the idea behind this model. And I think looking at the microsystem is so important when you're talking about child abuse and neglect, because I think another thing that people are often surprised to learn is most of these cases, in fact, 90% of these cases where children are abused and neglected are perpetrated by parents. So we have this perception in our society of stranger danger, right? Stay away from strangers that may hurt you. And while that certainly is very valid, and we want to be concerned about that, but when we look at these actual, what's actually happening in the data, 90% of the time, children are victimized by their parents. The other flip side of this is children, right now, we have a unification approach in child welfare, where if children can stay with their parents, and we think it's going to be reasonably safe for the child to do so, we're going to try to make that relationship work. And in fact, 80% of children who have these experiences stay with their parents. They may go away for a bit and be in kinship care, foster care, or some other type of care through the state. But 80% eventually make their way back to their parents. So what this indicates to me is child abuse and neglect represents a severe break in the parent-child relationship that really deviates from how we expect that the parent-child relationship is going to go. It really deviates from what we say is a standard of a healthy relationship in really the most extreme ways possible. But because most children are going to be reunified with their parents, it also represents an opportunity to go into the relationship and say, how can we help strengthen this relationship so that both the child and the parents are healthier at the end of the day? Okay. So I'm going to pause here real quick and take a question from the chat. So, because I'm not going to talk so much about forensic interview, and I'm going to talk more about this research, but how do you interview children based on their age levels? That is a really interesting question, and one that a lot of research has been devoted to. I should mention another thing that makes this even more complicated is children, it's particularly younger children that are most at risk for these experiences. So the majority of children who have these experiences are under the age of 5. Not saying that older children don't experience this, because they definitely do, but younger children are just more vulnerable. And by that, they tend to experience abuse and neglect disproportionately more often. So what happens is we have young children that they're still developing in their communication and cognitive skills, giving an interview in this really high stakes situation. So, sorry, there was just another question in the chat that I'll get to as well. So how do we interview based on age level? That is a really complex question that I could literally talk about that for hours. I think what I would say though is we definitely develop recommendations that are developmentally sensitive to the point that we're providing recommendations of language to use with children so that they, are using vocabulary that children would understand. But the principles of forensic interviewing in terms of what makes a good interview is actually quite standard across even adults to children. And what makes a really good interview, to put it simply, is allowing space for the person to tell their story. Oftentimes, when we're in these high stakes situations and we think that something may have happened, we may be inclined just to say, hey, I heard this happen. Did it happen? Yes or no is the implicit responses. Well, what happens when you start questioning that way is young children will start to give you answers that they think you want, regardless of whether or not the event actually did happen. And we see that in adults too. So what makes a good interview, even for very young children, is allowing them to tell the story. We don't put the details in, and we don't tell them that we think something happened to them. We allow them to tell us. So asking questions like, why are you here to see me today? What happened? Tell me more about that. Even very young children can provide narratives around, essentially, I'm like getting way off topic, but I hope this is answering this question a bit. By the age of 2, children can start to talk about the past, assuming that they have typically developing language and communication skills. Around the age of 3, children can start to provide narratives. They may be short, but they can do them. And it's our job to support their memory skills by asking questions that are going to help support their abilities. So they may need more follow-up questions. They may need more support in that way, but they can still provide forensically relevant details using the same principles that we do with adults. Yes, saying I believe you to the child is big, yes. Okay, so I think the next question in the chat is, how do we work to better the relationship with children and their parents? So I'm going to move on to that because that's directly related to my research. Are there any other questions?
In working with the parents and children, do you teach them, well, both coping skills to, I guess, for trauma, and then also as like the aggressor?
So I'm going to talk about a study where we actually did an intervention. So I should say from the start, I should have said this from the start, I am not a clinician. Any work that I do with parents and families is through the lens of a researcher. So I'm not providing therapy. I'm not, helping them cope with their trauma necessarily. I am the person that is doing the research behind the scenes to help inform best practices. Does that make sense? Mariah, does that make sense?
Oh, yeah, sorry, I put it in the chat.
Oh, I see it now. Okay, perfect. So I'm coming from the lens of a researcher, and one that, hopefully my research is being applied in the field, and I think there's good evidence to suggest that it is. But yes, so coping skills is something that I have looked at in my research. And one way that I'm interested in coping skills is, how do parents, and in terms of, fostering the parent-child relationship, how are parents talking about emotions with their children? That's a big one. And does this level of scaffolding or emotional communication among families that have these experiences of abuse and neglect, does that look different compared to families that do not have these histories? How does talking about emotions within the home, how does that relate to child well-being among children who have had this severe history of trauma? And does that have implications for forensic interviewing children? So coming back to that first point of identifying children. So I'm going to go a little bit into the weeds now about more specifically what my research focuses on in my lab. And something I am very interested in is understanding children's autobiographical memory development, their self-development, and their social and emotional development through the perspective of this social cultural theory. And this is a theory that says basically that parents scaffold these skills for us. And particularly in terms of coping, like Mariah said, or just general emotional understanding, parents are helping us develop our emotional knowledge, our emotional regulation and coping skills and understanding through talking about emotional events with us, right? That's how we learn about these experiences and how we learn about ourselves. The social cultural theory is specifically of autobiographical memory development, but has been extended to these other areas, says that as parents are talking to children about the past, they're literally providing, maybe not literally, but figuratively, providing a scaffolding. They're providing an internal structure for children to learn about how to think about their experiences, how to think about emotions, how to think about self-regulation and coping, all these kind of things that we've been talking about. How do children learn that? They're learning that through parent structuring and scaffolding. And it's really around the preschool years that children start to internalize the structure that is provided to them from parents. They not only internalize it, but they start to use it. They start to use that structure and scaffolding to talk to other people about their experiences, and to individually, independently on their own, start to regulate and react to emotional events. So this theory is all about parent structuring of narratives, but also emotions, and how that plays a really important role in children's independent abilities to self-regulate and narrate their experiences later. So that's a big focus or theoretical background for my research. I do have like a really cheesy example here that I think I'm going to skip over because we're running a little bit out of time. But this was an example of me talking with my niece, Danica, and I was trying to demonstrate some of the concepts of what we look at when we're evaluating or looking at how parents are communicating with their children. But there's basically two main things that we're interested in. And one thing is we're really interested in the types of questions parents are asking their children and the amount of details they are providing. There's loads of research among typically developing families showing that moms who ask more questions, in particular about past emotional events, moms who ask their children more questions like, who was there? What were we doing? Where were we? And mothers who embellish and provide details themselves and confirm their children. Loads of research showing that those children of mothers who do a lot of this go on to have better academic achievement. They go on to have better cognitive skills. They have better language skills. They have better emotional regulation. They even have better physiological functioning. There's some research showing this with cortisol levels are at healthier levels when parents are engaging in this type of discussion with their children. That's what I would call elaborative content. They're elaborating on the information. But this is quite different from emotional support. So this is where the coping comes in. Emotional support is talking with your children in a way where you're able to identify the emotions that they're experiencing. You're also able to provide resolutions to the emotions that they're experiencing. It wouldn't be very healthy if you're talking with your child and you're like, oh yeah, you dropped that ice cream, you were devastated. Okay, bye. And just leaving the child hang with that negative emotion. A key part of being emotionally supportive is helping the child to understand a positive resolution and how they overcame that negative feeling. That links in with the coping that Mariah mentioned. And then also just being coherent. That's really important too. Negative events in particular are very confusing for young children. And they're often going to turn to their parents to help them make sense of it. So again, parents are providing a lot of the scaffolding through talking with their children about negative and emotional past events. Elaborative content and emotional support are two dimensions that parents can differ on. You guys can probably imagine we can have a mom, for example, that is really high in elaborative content, ask loads and loads of questions and provides loads of details, but is not emotionally supportive, right? Like asking lots of details, but doing it in a way that's very controlling, very negating, not helping the child understand emotions. And we can have the opposite. We can have a mom who's really high on emotional support, but not having very elaborative conversations. And in my research, I have posited that it's really when moms are high, and I'm saying moms broadly, caregivers is probably the more correct term. But it's really when they're high in both, when they're engaging in this elaborative content and providing support from the emotional aspect, that we're going to see the children really benefit. Now, how does this link into child maltreatment and helping the family? We know from prior research that families that have a history of abuse and neglect don't engage in communication as frequently as demographically similar families that don't have those experiences. So verbal communication or verbal interactions, there's fewer of them among maltreating families. We also know that expression of emotion is not really welcomed in many of these homes. And we also know that when children do express emotions, often they're negated and it's not a supportive environment. So I just talked about how important this is for coping. In this context, we don't necessarily see the supportive and elaborative discussions happen similarly to how we see them in matched families that do not have these experiences. So I'm going to dive in. We have about 13 minutes left. I'm just going to dive into one study that I've conducted to give you guys a more in-depth, but hopefully still a high picture level on what my research aims to do. And setting up this background, we talked about how child maltreatment is related to a lot of negative consequences for children across a lifespan. The study I'm going to show you is looking at autobiographical memory in particular. So we know this link, this bottom link, maltreatment is negatively related to autobiographical memory. That is pretty well established, but we don't know why. And one reason that I hypothesize in my research is, well, maybe these maltreating families, maybe they're not engaging in this elaborative and emotionally supportive talking about the past or reminiscing that we know is so important and helps to positively increase cognitive skills. So trying to understand why child maltreatment is related with these negative outcomes, and if I identify that this relationship is driven by impairments in the parent-child relationship, then that can help to identify areas that we can target with intervention. This is some more details about the study in general. This was what I'm going to present to you was data that I worked on when I was a postdoc, but very recently published. Someone mentioned earlier, if I do longitudinal work, this project is not longitudinal. The data I'm going to present is not longitudinal, but the project is. In this project, we follow children who have been maltreated for an entire year and several time points. And it also included an intervention component that I will briefly talk about. Just to give some high level details, I know this, or I guess this is the opposite of high level details, but some nitty gritty details for those of you that are interested in statistics or research. We had 248 mothers, and importantly, this was done with preschoolers, 3 to 6 year olds. To be classified as a maltreating family, the parents had to perpetrate at least one instance of abuse or neglect against their child. And then we had demographic comparison children who had no history of child abuse and neglect. So we're able to compare and contrast the two groups. This data I'm going to present to you was recently published last year in Child Development. And that's just the picture because I just have to apparently plug myself even more through this talk. What I'm interested in looking at here is my research broadly does focus on autobiographical memory, self and emotional development, but there's various facets of autobiographical memory. And what I'm going to present here is looking at autobiographical memory specificity, which is our ability to recall specific one-time events from the past. And this is really relevant in a population that's had trauma because there's loads of research showing that individuals that have trauma may have difficulty in recalling specific one-time experiences from their past. And one reason for that that is posited follows this self-memory model of autobiographical memory, which says that when we go to retrieve autobiographical memory events, we start first at this really general category where we may just search lifetime periods, and I'll give you examples. And then as we continue the search, we get more narrow and narrow. So for example, if you were to say to me, hey, Dr. Lawson, tell me one time you felt embarrassed. Okay, when I go to retrieve that memory, I'm first going to search this like general lifetime period. And I might just start thinking about like, oh, relationships, work, and school. And of course, this is happening all subconsciously to us. We're not aware that this is happening. But hey, Dr. Lawson, tell me one time you felt embarrassed. I may just think about relationships. And then I may think about weddings. And if I were to stop here at the general level, when you say, hey, Dr. Lawson, tell me about one time you felt embarrassed, I would say every time when my husband dances at weddings. Something that unfortunately has happened over and over again in my life. This is certainly not a one-time experience. But if I was able to dig a little bit deeper into my search and get down to that specific last part of the triangle here, I would say, oh, I was really embarrassed that time when my husband was dancing at my brother's wedding when he was getting introduced as part of the, bridal party and the reception. I do have to say, mostly because my husband is listening down here somewhere, that he is actually a really good dancer, to the point that like people in my family have commented like, oh, we're so sad that we don't have more frequent weddings because we love watching your husband dance. I just had to like throw that out there. But that's a specific memory, saying, oh, at my brother's wedding, that is a specific memory, versus saying all the time, that's general. Why do we care about this? We know that individuals that have this more general tendency to recall events, so they recall things that happen over and over again, or things that happen for an extended period of time, those individuals tend to demonstrate more psychopathology. And not only do they have higher levels of psychopathology like depression, anxiety, and PTSD, but this general way of recalling the past is also associated with the onset and the maintenance. So when psychopathology comes on and how long it lasts. So it's really important from a mental health standpoint. We also know that adults who have a history of childhood trauma tend to recall events at this general level. They tend to not go specific. They tend to stop right at the general level. And why does this happen? There's a couple of reasons why this may happen. One reason is called the functional avoidance hypothesis, which is that if I am an individual with trauma and I start to think about my past, and if I allow myself to go deep enough into specific events, I may recall the trauma. And that's going to be uncomfortable, right? And that could be something that I would be motivated not to do. So in efforts to avoid recalling the trauma, I may stop at this general level of retrieval. But what happens is we find that this general level of retrieval will get me to avoid trauma, but then because it works, it can get rewarded over time and applied to events that are not even traumatic. Like the example with my husband dancing. A little bit traumatic, but not really. So it can apply to our general memory function. Or maybe what's happening, like I have posited, is maybe what's really happening is children who have been abused and neglected are just not getting the support they need in their homes to develop their own memory skills. So maybe it's this idea that, yeah, we do see these impairments among children who have been maltreated, but maybe that's because they're not getting the support through their parent-child interactions. I know we only have 5 more minutes, so I'm gonna speed through this just a little bit. But what I do in my research, and this is very common, I look at observations of how parents and children talk about the past. And I often ask them to talk about times where the child was happy, sad, scared, and angry. So there's a focus on negative events, and these are everyday experiences. And from these observations, I can look at the style of maternal talk, her elaborative content, and her emotional support that we talked about earlier. In terms of measuring autobiographical memory specificity, we literally measure this by saying, tell me one time you felt, and then we fill in all of these emotions. And we can see, like, is the child providing a narrative about a one-time event, or are they engaging in this overgeneral way of retrieving experiences from their past? Now, this gets a little super statsy, but what I will say is when we look at children's autobiographical memory specificity in this study, we saw that there were impairments in children who have been abused and neglected. Specifically, though, it was the neglected children who had a very hard time recalling specific past events. When we asked them to tell me one time you felt, and then those certain emotions, the neglected children often provided these very general events that were not specific at all. And when we looked at maternal reminiscing, so how are moms talking with their children, it was particularly the neglecting mothers that had difficulty engaging in reminiscing conversations with their children. This is very big and a little bit scary, but this is a model showing that neglect was negatively associated with children's autobiographical memory specificity, which again puts them at risk for all of these later outcomes in terms of psychopathology. And it was also neglect that was negatively associated with how moms are talking about the past of their children. So what we saw overall, I'm just going to skip through this, but what we saw overall was the reason that we're seeing this deficit among children who have been neglected is because they're not getting the support through their parent-child interactions to develop narratives and to develop an autobiographical memory. And just hitting back on, someone was asking, and we did talk about interventions in particular. The nice thing about identifying reminiscing as being a very important factor is reminiscing is modifiable. And I actually published in 2019 on an intervention where we were able to train mothers who have abused and neglected their children to engage in more elaborative and more emotionally supportive conversations with their children. And I have more slides, but I think I'll stop here. And I'll just say that this intervention, okay, I don't have that slide in here. But this intervention, we trained mothers to talk more elaboratively and more supportive with their children. 8 weeks after that intervention, mothers who have maltreated their children and got their intervention looked very similar to mothers who have not maltreated their children. And in fact, we're now doing longitudinal research on this intervention, and we're seeing that children who have been maltreated, if their mothers got this intervention, even up to a year later, they are starting to look very similar to children who never had those experiences. So it's very powerful. And we're seeing this not only in children's autobiographical memory skills, we're also seeing this in very other important areas. So we're seeing this in children's internalizing and externalizing behaviors. And I think maybe most convincing is we're actually also seeing this in cortisol levels. So at a physiological level, where maltreated children of parents that got this intervention, a year later, even physiologically, they are looking very similar to children that never even had these experiences. So speaking to the importance of the parent-child relationship in fostering healthy development among children who have had these experiences. Okay, I know we are over time, so I think the last thing I will say is I include students in my research from the whole start to the end. These pictures are with some of my students when I was a grad student, because we've been mostly online since I have been here and have not been able to take lots of pictures. But if you're interested in this type of research or just learning more and even just talking with me, please shoot me an email. I am accepting students for the spring semester to join my lab. I'm mostly I'm in need of students that are bilingual, specifically English and Spanish. But if you're not bilingual, I am still taking monolingual students as well. And students at any period in your training are welcome to apply. I often take freshmen, sophomores, juniors. So please feel free to reach out if this is of interest to you. I hope this was interesting, and I hope I didn't bore you guys too much for a Tuesday evening. Thank you, guys. And these are the classes I teach. I know that it's 6 o'clock, but I would be happy to entertain any questions.
I just want to say thank you for presenting. And if you're still here, you should definitely take one of her classes, because I did, and it's one of my favorites. So
thank you, Alexis. Yeah, so we have one comment about appreciating the statistics. You know, I went back and forth on that because I know that not everyone has statistical understanding, but at the same time, I was like, ooh, maybe going in a little bit deep would actually be appreciated. So at least one student appreciated it.
I have a question.
Hi, Mariah.
Hello. So as far as, because I've heard that whenever kids go through traumatic events, then their body starts to create cortisol, and it's like that for the rest of their life because that's just what their body has adapted to.
Yeah.
So with mothers who have gone through the training, it's not training, but you know what I mean. Those children get better, like have less cortisol in themselves, or does it still?
Yes. So the you're absolutely right that cortisol is our stress hormone. So as we experience more stressors in our life, our cortisol is going to be more activated. And that can be very bad. That can lead to inflammation and chronic health problems. What we specifically have looked at in my team is the cortisol awakening slope. So basically what typically happens when you wake up is you have a high level of cortisol that declines throughout the day. Children who have been abused and neglected, though, tend to have a blunt slope. It doesn't decline, it just stays. And what we're starting to see through the intervention is that children who have been maltreated with parents who had the training and the intervention, their slopes are starting to look more similar to children that never had those experiences. And part of that is because the training, it seems very simple, right? Like we're just training moms to like talk with their kids in more emotionally sensitive ways, but that's really important because that's how children learn how to regulate experiences. And that's how they learn to deal with stressors and to cope. So by introducing that into their lives, we're seeing drastic improvements.
That's awesome.
I think it's pretty awesome. I think it's so powerful. You know, like I tell people that know I'm a psychologist, but they don't really know my work. I'm like, I studied how we talk with our children and how that can be very powerful. And it seems like, oh, it's just a conversation, like whatever, but there's so much power behind it. You know, especially from the preschool ages on, that's our main mode of communicating, right? In infancy, we communicate with children by attending to their physical needs, like, oh, they're crying, they need a diaper change, they need food. But really from the preschool years on, the main way that we help children to self-regulate is through engaging in communication with them and talking about emotions with them. And there's lots of different ways we can do that. Some are going to be more successful than others. Any other questions or comments?
Would you be able to send me the presentation? I know someone was asking about the class list.
Yes, I would be happy to do that. Thank you guys so much for having me. I always love I love that. How's your research impacted the way that, sorry, there was just another question that popped up. Maybe personal, how has your research affected the way you interact with children in your families? I think that's a great question. And I don't think it's like too personal at all. It's really funny because being a developmental psychologist, people would expect that you interact with children like 100% the best way all the time, right? And for full disclosure, my husband and I don't have any children. So most of my interaction is through my nieces and nephews and my cousin's children. But there's like this expectation that because I know a lot about kids and I know a lot about parenting, that I'll just like automatically be the best at it. And I can just say, like, that is not the case. You're still, if these interactions are really hard to have. And I think, though, what my research does is it informs me on ways that I want to approach interacting with children. So from this approach, I think, one way that this has had direct impact on me is just how I speak with my nieces and nephews. So if I'm interested in talking with them, I do a lot of the elaborative and emotionally supportive conversations. I try to practice what my research is teaching us. I try to engage in those type of interactions. And I think it's helpful. I think it helps to build strong relationships, especially with my nieces and nephews, allows them to know that I'm here for them too, right? Because it opens this dialogue of, I want to hear what you have to tell me, and I'm going to be emotionally supportive. So that research I for sure have tried to integrate, but I would say like broadly, it's really funny. I'm a developmental psychologist. All my colleagues, not all, but my colleagues in my research field are all developmental psychologists. And it's crazy because we all identify that there's like this perception that we would be the perfect parents or the perfect babysitter or whatever it is. And we're probably pretty good, but sometimes this stuff is hard to implement. But definitely how I communicate with my family members has been something I am very aware of because of my research. Just like on a side note, I apparently just want to continue to hear myself talk. I was at a conference once and having lunch with someone. Her name is Dr. Deborah Pohl. She's in Michigan. And she is like, she recently retired and she had just an impeccable research career. It's a huge name in developmental psychology, and especially in my area. And just to illustrate what I'm talking to you guys about, I was having lunch with her at a conference with a fellow graduate student, and we're like eating at this pub, this like pub and brewery. And she's like, girls, let me tell you something. And she was like, let me tell you something about parenting. And I was like, oh my God, we're about to get blessed. Like the key to life, by this premier world-renowned developmental psychologist. And she goes, when they first come out, if they look a little funny, that's okay. They'll fill out. And I'm like, this is it. This is like the parenting advice that I'm getting from this world-renowned developmental psychologist, But I think that just goes to say that I think people who study this research, like any research, it definitely informs what you're doing, but we're all still humans too, right? And we can try to implement it the best that we can, and I think we do, but we're still humans. So yeah, do not be afraid if they look a little funny, they will fill out, was the advice that we got. Okay. Anything else, guys? Debbie and Alexis, how did you guys like that approach to the talk? Too much?
No, I liked it. I mean, I've heard this presentation a few times already, and each time I just love it. So
yeah, I knew the answer to your football field question, but I didn't want to say it. I was like, I'll let someone else take it.
I'm always like, most people super lowball their estimates. And then like someone normally like throws out a super high number that they think will never actually be the number. So I'm pretty sure the 50 was that today, and it ended up being the number. But I remember doing that once, and someone was like 300. And I'm like, okay, like you're purposely trying to take away my impact here, right? You're like purposely trying to take this away from me. But yeah, I think it's a good illustration, and I hope that the students found value in this. And I know I've come to talk to Psych Club a lot before, but I wanted to dig a little bit more into my actual studies than I have before. So I hope I didn't lose you guys. Like, I hope it was still at a level that you guys could follow.
I know for me, at least, like I like the stats and I liked the charts and like so, I mean, that's just me, but I liked it.
Okay.
I'm glad that there was like the charts so I could like visually see it, because I feel like if you had just spoke about it, it would have just gone like straight over my head.
Perfect. That's good feedback. You know, again, because I realize some of you guys may have had stats already or not. And even the stats that I'm doing are a little bit more advanced than what you would have at an undergraduate level. So it's like, ooh, I don't want to lose them. But at the same time, I want them to see what research really is. You know, so hopefully I had like a good balance.
I think so.
Awesome. Okay, well, I think if that's it, we can go ahead and log off.
Yeah.
I meant to plug, and I will plug it to the remaining 6 of you, that we have Prof Talk tonight. I forgot to plug that. So I mentioned last time it's IO. IO is actually at the end of the month. I kind of misspoke. But today is going to be just as exciting. The person who is coming to speak with us is a researcher for Xbox. Like, that's pretty cool. So I'm going to be a little out of my wheelhouse because I don't play video games at all. But it will be really exciting. I think that's just a really interesting take on psychology research being done in like industry too, because she works for Xbox. So
yeah.
Well, go ahead.
Oh no, I was just saying like, yeah, like I'm gonna go because I think it's interesting. So.
Yeah, please come share your friends. So we start at 8 o'clock tonight. And don't like hesitate to be active in the chat. We love when you guys engage in the chat with us. So if you have questions, throw them in. Would love to hear from you guys.
Dr. Lawson, if you want to send me the link, I can send it in the SPA social chat.
Oh, that would be awesome. Yes, give me a second and I'll the link to Prof Talk on Twitch. Okay. Give me 1 second. I know Dr. Swan just sent out the blast earlier.
I sent it already to the officers. I'll just send it again.
Okay.
So I can do that right now. So you don't have to worry about it.
I'll put it here too in the chat anyways. Okay. Well, it will be great to see you guys there. And otherwise, the officers, Debbie, will be in contact about the grant, and just let us know how we can support you. But I think, again, like picking something, going with it, making sure it's feasible, you can write it up. And then if you actually get the money, it's feasible too. Yeah, you guys have lots of great ideas.
I think what we could do is create like a plan A and a plan B. And then I guess you and Dr. Scott can choose one. And that's what
I think you guys, yeah, but that's a lot of work to write up 2 things. I think you guys have gut intuition. Like, you guys know, you have a good pulse on what students would be interested in. And you guys, as you're running the organization, you have a good idea on, you know, what is feasible with the organization how the group is organized, like the leadership, as you were mentioning earlier. I think we would really trust you guys to pick what you think is best. And then we can get feedback on like specific, you know, wording and phrasing and things like that.
Yes, I think, well, Emily's going to do the application and everything. So we're going to meet tomorrow before the interview, and we'll send an email out right away.
Okay, that sounds good. All right, well, thank you guys for having me. It's always a blast getting to talk to the Psych Club. So thank you.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.